Poor twins wait alone in a millionaire arrives and sees they have his last name. The sterile fluorescent lights of St. Mary's General Hospital cast harsh shadows across the emergency room's worn linoleum floors. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in late October, and the Chicago wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass with each fierce gust. Inside, the usual symphony of hospital sounds filled the air, beeping monitors, hushed conversations between nurses, and the occasional groan of pain from patients waiting their turn. Daniel Remington sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, his tailored charcoal suit standing out starkly against the backdrop of tired faces and hospital gowns. At 42, he carried himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to boardrooms and private jets, not public emergency rooms. His dark hair, peppered with premature grey at the temples, was perfectly styled despite the late hour. The Patek Philippe watch on his wrist, worth more than most people's annual salary, caught the harsh lighting as he flexed his injured hand. Stupid, really, he muttered to himself, examining the swollen wrist that had brought him here. A fall during his evening jog through Lincoln Park had resulted in what his personal physician suspected was a minor sprain, but protocol demanded an X-ray to rule out fractures. Daniel had initially resisted coming to a public hospital, but his usual private medical facility was closed for renovations, and the pain had become increasingly bothersome. The emergency room was busier than he'd expected for a weeknight. An elderly man with a persistent cough sat near the entrance, while a young mother bounced a crying infant, trying to soothe the child's fever. The air smelled of antiseptic and anxiety, a combination that made Daniel increasingly uncomfortable. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails from his assistant about tomorrow's board meeting, anything to distract himself from the unfamiliar environment. It was then that he noticed them. In the far corner of the waiting room, almost hidden, behind a large potted plant that had seen better days, sat two small figures. Daniel's attention was initially drawn by their unusual stillness. In a room full of restless, worried people, these two children sat perfectly quiet, their small hands folded in their laps, like they'd been taught to be invisible. The twins couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Even from across the room, Daniel could see they were identical. The same sandy brown hair that fell in unruly waves, the same delicate features, the same wide eyes that seemed too old for their young faces. Their clothes told a story of struggle. Jeans with carefully mended patches, sneakers that had clearly been bought second-hand, and matching sweaters that were clean but obviously worn thin from countless washings. What struck Daniel most was their posture. They sat with the kind of careful stillness that spoke of children who had learned not to draw attention to themselves, who understood that being quiet meant being safe. The boy had his arm around his sister's shoulders in a protective gesture that seemed far too mature for his age, while she clutched a small, well-loved stuffed rabbit to her chest. Daniel found himself studying them with growing curiosity. There was something familiar about their features, something that nagged at the edges of his memory like a half-remembered dream. The shape of their eyes, perhaps, or the stubborn set of their small jaws. It reminded him of someone, though I couldn't quite place who. Mr. Remington? A voice broke through his thoughts. A tired-looking nurse with graying hair and kind eyes stood before him, clipboard in hand. "We're ready for your X-ray now." "Actually," Daniel said, surprising himself, "could you tell me about those children over there? The twins. Are they here alone?" The nurse followed his gaze, and her expression softened with sympathy. "Emma and Ethan," she said quietly. "Poor little things have been here for hours. Their mother was brought in earlier, collapsed at home. She's in intensive care now. Where's their father?" "From what I understand, there isn't one in the picture. It's just been the three of them." The nurse shook her head sadly. "Social services. have been called, but they're swamped tonight. The kids are just waiting to hear about their mom. Daniel felt an odd tightness in his chest. What's their last name? The nurse glanced at her clipboard, then back at Daniel with a slightly puzzled expression. Remington, actually. Same as yours. Funny coincidence, isn't it? The world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. Daniel stared at the nurse, certain he'd misheard. I'm sorry, did you say Remington? Yes, sir. Emma and Ethan Remington. Like I said, quite a coincidence. Daniel's mind raced, fragments of memories he'd buried years ago suddenly surfacing like pieces of a broken mirror, catching light. Remington wasn't an uncommon name, he told himself. It had to be a coincidence. But even as he tried to rationalize it, his eyes were drawn back to the children, and that nagging sense of familiarity grew stronger. Mr. Remington? Sir? The nurse was looking at him with concern. Are you feeling all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. Yes, I'm fine, Daniel managed, though his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. The X-ray can wait a few minutes. I need to make a phone call. The nurse nodded, though she continued to regard him with curious eyes. Of course, take your time. Daniel walked toward the hospital's main entrance, pulling out his phone with shaking fingers. The cold October air hit him like a slap as he stepped outside, but he barely noticed. His mind was spinning, trying to piece together fragments of a past he'd worked hard to forget. Sarah. The name came to him unbidden, along with a flood of memories he'd kept locked away for over a decade. Sarah Mitchell, young, beautiful, fierce in her independence. They'd met during his final year at Northwestern, when he was still Danny Remington, a scholarship kid, trying to make something of himself, not the billionaire tech mogul he'd become. She'd been studying to be a teacher, working 2 jobs to pay for school, and she'd had dreams as big as his own. They'd been inseparable for 2 years, talking about futures and forever, with the passionate certainty of young love. But then came the offer. A chance to join a startup in Silicon Valley, an opportunity that could change everything. Sarah had wanted to come with him, but her mother was sick. Her family needed her. The fight they'd had still echoed in his memory, harsh words spoken in anger and frustration. You're choosing money over love, she'd accused him, tears streaming down her face in the shabby apartment they'd shared. I'm choosing our future, he'd shoot back. This could set us up for life. What if I don't want to be set up? What if I just want us? But he'd been young and ambitious and absolutely certain that success would solve everything. He'd left for California, promising to come back for her, promising that it would only be temporary. The startup had exploded beyond anyone's wildest dreams, and Daniel had found himself swept up in a world of venture capital and IPOs, of 18-hour days and endless meetings with investors. The calls to Sarah had become less frequent, the promises to visit home more vague. When he'd finally returned to Chicago 18 months later, wealthy beyond his wildest dreams and ready to sweep her off her feet, he'd found her apartment empty. The neighbors said she'd moved away months ago, leaving no forwarding address. He'd hired a private investigator, but Sarah Mitchell had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. That had been 12 years ago. Daniel had eventually convinced himself it was for the best. They'd been too young, too different. He'd built his empire, dated socialites and celebrities, lived the life he'd always dreamed of. But sometimes, in quiet moments, he still wondered what had happened to the girl who'd loved him before he'd had anything to offer but himself. Now, staring through the hospital's glass doors at 2 small children who carried his name, Daniel felt the carefully constructed walls around his past beginning to crumble. He dialed his assistant's number despite the late hour. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite having been awakened. Daniel, what's wrong? Are you hurt? Marcus, I need you to run a search for me tonight. Sarah Mitchell, last known address, Chicago, Illinois. Expand the search parameters to include any variations of the name and cross-reference with the surname Remington. "Sir, it's nearly midnight. I don't care what time it is. This is urgent. Call me back as soon as you have anything." Daniel ended the call and stood in the cold night air, his breath forming small clouds in the October chill. Through the glass, he could see the twins still sitting in their corner, their small forms barely visible behind the potted plant. The boy, Ethan, was stroking his sister's hair in a gesture that was heartbreakingly adult, while Emma continued to clutch her stuffed rabbit. Could they be? The thought was too enormous to complete, too frightening in its implications. But as Daniel studied their faces, he began to see things he'd missed before. The stubborn set of the boy's jaw was exactly like his own at that age. The girl's eyes, wide and green, were the same shade as Sarah's had been. His phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. Marcus's voice was tight with urgency. "Daniel, I found her. Sarah Mitchell, now Sarah Remington. She's in intensive care at St. Mary's General Hospital. Admitted 3 hours ago with complications from pneumonia. And Daniel, there's more. Birth certificates for twins, Emma and Ethan Remington, born October 15th, 8 years ago. Father is listed as Daniel Remington." The phone slipped from Daniel's, suddenly numb fingers clattering on the concrete sidewalk. Through the glass doors, Emma looked up as if sensing his gaze, and for a moment, their eyes met across the crowded waiting room. In that instant, Daniel saw himself in her features as clearly as if he were looking in a mirror, and he knew with absolute certainty that his world had just changed forever. He was a father, and the woman he'd never stopped loving was fighting for her life just floors above him. Daniel picked up his phone with trembling hands and walked back into the hospital, each step feeling like he was walking toward a destiny he'd never imagined. The twins watched him approach, their eyes wide, with the wariness of children who had learned too young that adults often brought disappointment. But there was something else there too, a flicker of hope perhaps, or recognition. "Emma, Ethan." His voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "My name is Daniel, Daniel Remington." The little girl's grip on her stuffed rabbit tightened, while the boy's protective arm around his sister's shoulders tensed. They'd been taught not to talk to strangers. That much was clear. But something in Daniel's voice must have convinced them he wasn't a threat. "Are you here about Mommy?" Emma asked in a small voice that broke Daniel's heart. "The doctor said she's very sick." Daniel struggled to find words that wouldn't terrify them further. "How did you tell 2 children that you might be the father who'd never known they existed? How did you explain 12 years of absence in terms an 8-year-old could understand?" "I knew your mother a long time ago," he said finally, crouching down to their level. We were very good friends." Ethan's eyes narrowed with suspicion beyond his years. "If you were friends, why haven't we met you before?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow, out of the mouths of babes, cutting straight to the heart of his guilt and shame. "It's complicated," he said lamely, then immediately regretted the adult non-answer. These children deserved better than evasions. Your mother and I, we lost touch. Sometimes that happens with grown-ups, even when they care about each other very much. But I'm here now. Emma studied his face with those eerily familiar green eyes. You have the same name as us. Yes, I do. And you look like Ethan, she continued with the brutal honesty of childhood. Mama says Ethan has a strong chin like his daddy. Daniel felt tears prick at his eyes, tears he hadn't shed in years. Does she? What else does your mama say about your daddy? The twins exchanged a look that spoke of private conversations and whispered questions. It was Ethan who answered, his voice careful and protective. She says he was smart and kind, but that he had to go away before we were born. She says maybe someday we'll meet him, but that it's just us three for now, and that's okay. Just us three. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. While he'd been building his empire, attending charity galas, and dating women whose names he could barely remember. Sarah had been raising their children alone. She'd been working multiple jobs, struggling to make ends meet, protecting these beautiful, brave little souls from the truth of their father's abandonment. "Mr. Remington?" A new voice interrupted his thoughts. A doctor in scrubs approached, his expression grave. "I understand you're here about Ms. Remington. Are you family?" Daniel looked at the twins, then back at the doctor. For the first time in 12 years, he answered that question honestly. "Yes," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. "I'm their father." The doctor's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he nodded professionally. "Could I speak with you privately?" Daniel looked down at Emma and Ethan, who were watching the exchange with growing anxiety. "Will you two be okay here for just a minute? I need to talk to the doctor about your mom." Emma nodded solemnly, though her grip on her rabbit never loosened. "Tell her we're being good," she whispered. "Tell her we're waiting." "I will, sweetheart, I promise." As Daniel followed the doctor down a sterile corridor, he caught sight of their reflection in a darkened window. A man in an expensive suit walking away from two children who had every right to hate him. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years afraid of commitment, of being tied down, of the responsibilities that came with love. Now he was discovering that he'd been a father all along, and his children were strangers. The doctor led him to a small consultation room and gestured for him to sit. "Mr. Remington, I need to be direct with you. Ms. Remington's condition is serious. She came in with what appeared to be pneumonia, but it's complicated by severe malnutrition and exhaustion. Her immune system is compromised, likely from months of overwork and stress." Daniel felt sick. "Will she's stable for now, but the next 24 hours are critical. I have to ask, where have you been?" The children mentioned they've been living alone with their mother, and from what we can see, it's been a struggle. The judgment in the doctor's voice was clear, and Daniel couldn't argue with it. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I didn't know they existed." The doctor's expression softened slightly. "I see. That's a complicated situation. Right now, though, those children need stability. They've been incredibly brave, but they're scared and exhausted. Social services are involved, but if you're truly their father..." "I am." Daniel's voice was firm. "DNA test, whatever you need. But I'm not letting them go into the system." "Mr. Remington, parenting isn't something you can just decide to do overnight. These children have been through trauma. So have I," Daniel interrupted, then immediately regretted the defensive tone. "I'm sorry. I know how this looks. I know I have no right to waltz in here and claim them after 8 years. But they're my children, and their mother is... Sarah is someone I cared about very much. I'm not walking away again." The doctor studied him for a long moment. "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Remington?" "I'm in technology. I own a company." Daniel decided that mentioning his net worth would sound like bragging at a moment like this. Well, financial stability is certainly a factor, but those children are going to need more than money. They're going to need patience, understanding, and a complete restructuring of your life. Are you prepared for that? Daniel thought about his penthouse apartment with its stark modern lines and complete lack of anything child-friendly. He thought about his 70-hour work weeks, his business trips to 3 different continents each month, his carefully ordered existence that had no room for scraped knees and bedtime stories. "I'll figure it out," he said, and for the first time in years, he meant something completely. When they returned to the waiting room, Daniel found the twins exactly where he'd left them, though Emma had fallen asleep against her brother's shoulder. Ethan was awake, watching the door, with eyes that held too much worry for someone so young. "Is Mama okay?" he asked as soon as he saw Daniel approaching. Daniel sat down in the chair across from them, choosing his words carefully. "She's very sick, but the doctors are taking good care of her. She needs rest and medicine to get better. Hey, can we see her? Not tonight, buddy, but maybe tomorrow when she's feeling a little stronger. Ethan nodded, accepting this with the resignation of a child who'd learned not to expect too much from adults. What happens to us if Mama doesn't get better? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Daniel looked at this brave little boy who'd been protecting his sister, who'd been the man of the house at 8 years old, and felt something shift inside his chest. A fierce, protective instinct he'd never experienced before. You don't have to worry about that, Daniel said firmly. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Ethan studied his face with those unnervingly adult eyes. You promise? Daniel thought about all the promises he'd broken in his life, all the people he'd let down in pursuit of his ambitions. But looking at this child, his child, he knew that this was the one promise he couldn't afford to break. I promise, he said, and for the first time in years, he felt like he might actually be able to keep his word. As the night wore on, Daniel found himself telling the twins stories about their mother when she was young. Carefully edited versions that focused on her dreams of becoming a teacher, her love of old movies, the way she used to laugh at his terrible jokes. Emma woke up during one of these stories, listening with wide eyes, as Daniel described how their mother had once spent an entire weekend helping him study for a particularly difficult exam. She's still like that, Emma said sleepily. She helps all the kids at her school, even when she's tired. She works at a school? She's a teacher, Ethan said proudly. 3rd grade. She says teaching is the most important job in the world because you get to help kids learn to dream. Daniel felt another piece of his heart break. Sarah had achieved her dream after all, even without his support. She'd become the teacher she'd always wanted to be, was clearly beloved by her students, and had raised 2 remarkable children in the process. All while he'd been accumulating wealth and accolades, she'd been building something far more valuable. Around 3 a.m., a social worker arrived, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Ms. Patterson. She spoke with Daniel. Privately, her questions pointed and her skepticism clear. Mr. Remington, I have to be honest with you. The fact that you've been absent from these children's lives for 8 years is concerning. Even if paternity is established, we'll need to conduct a full investigation before. I understand, Daniel interrupted. Do whatever you need to do. Run background checks, interview my employees, examine my finances. But those children are not spending another night wondering if they'll have a home. Miss Patterson's expression softened slightly. I can see you care about them, but caring isn't enough. These children have been through significant trauma. They'll need counseling, stability and routine. Are you prepared to provide that? Daniel looked through the small window into the waiting room, where Emma and Ethan had finally fallen asleep, curled up together in the uncomfortable plastic chairs. Someone had given them a hospital blanket, and they were sharing it, their small faces peaceful in sleep despite everything they'd been through. I'll learn, he said simply. Whatever they need, whatever it takes, I'll learn. The social worker studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I'm going to allow them to stay with you tonight, under supervision. We'll revisit the situation in the morning once we know more about their mother's condition. As dawn broke over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Daniel found himself in the strangest situation of his life. He was sitting in a hospital waiting room, wearing a wrinkled suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, with 2 sleeping children, his children, curled up on either side of him. Emma had abandoned her chair entirely and was curled up with her head in his lap, while Ethan had moved closer during the night until he was leaning against Daniel's shoulder. For a man who'd spent years avoiding commitment, who'd built his life around the principle of never being tied down, it should have felt terrifying. Instead, as he watched the sunrise through the hospital windows and felt the gentle weight of his children's trust, Daniel realized he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt like he was home. The morning brought news that Sarah's condition had stabilized during the night. She was still in intensive care, but the doctors were cautiously optimistic. Daniel felt a relief so profound it left him shaking, though he couldn't tell if it was for Sarah's sake or because he wasn't ready to explain death to two 8-year-olds who had already faced too much loss. As Emma and Ethan woke up, stretching and yawning in the morning light, Daniel made a decision that would change all their lives forever. "How would you two feel about coming home with me?" he asked gently. "Just until your mom is better." The twins exchanged one of their wordless looks, conducting an entire conversation with their eyes. Finally, Emma spoke up, her voice small, but brave. "Will you really take care of us, even if we're scared sometimes?" Daniel looked down at this courageous little girl who was already protecting her heart from further disappointment and felt his own heart crack wide open. "Especially if you're scared sometimes," he promised. "That's what daddies are for." And as the morning sun streamed through the hospital windows, illuminating the faces of two children who were about to change his world forever, Daniel Remington began the most important chapter of his life. 3 weeks later, Daniel stood in the doorway of what had once been his pristine home office, watching Emma and Ethan transform the space into something he never could have imagined. The minimalist desk where he'd once conducted million-dollar deals was now covered with crayons, coloring books, and what appeared to be a half-finished art project involving an alarming amount of glitter. His expensive leather chair had been replaced with 2 small desks from IKEA, a purchase that had required his first ever trip to the Swedish furniture store, an adventure that had left him exhausted and Emma and Ethan in fits of giggles over his inability to pronounce Björkudden. "Daddy, look," Emma called out, holding up a drawing that featured 3 stick figures standing in front of what might have been a house or possibly a rainbow. Her artistic style was still developing. "It's us!" The word "daddy" still sent a shock through Daniel's system every time he heard it. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a bachelor who measured his success in stock prices and quarterly reports. Now he found himself getting emotional over crayon drawings and feeling ridiculously proud when Ethan remembered to put his dishes in the dishwasher without being asked. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Daniel said, crouching down to examine the artwork more closely. "Is that our house?" "Uh-huh. And that's you, and that's me, and that's Ethan, and see," she pointed to a smaller figure with yellow hair. "That's Mama, for when she comes home." The drawing of Sarah was positioned slightly apart from the other figures, as if Emma wasn't quite sure where her mother fit into this new configuration of their family. It was a detail that broke Daniel's heart a little more each time he noticed it in the children's artwork and conversations. This careful uncertainty about how to reconcile their old life with their new one. Sarah had been moved from intensive care to a regular room 5 days ago, and while her recovery was progressing well, she remained weak and wasn't yet ready for visitors beyond the brief, carefully supervised meetings Daniel had arranged. The children spoke to her by phone every day, but Daniel knew they were struggling with the separation and the confusion of their dramatically changed circumstances. "Mr. Remington," a voice from the hallway interrupted his thoughts. Maria Santos, the nanny he'd hired after a frantic series of interviews, appeared in the doorway. At 55, Maria had raised 4 children of her own and had 15 years of experience helping other families navigate the complexities of parenthood. More importantly, Emma and Ethan had taken to her immediately, drawn to her warm laugh and seemingly endless patience. "The school called," Maria continued in her slight Spanish accent. "They'd like to meet with you this afternoon about Emma and Ethan's enrollment." Daniel nodded, checking his watch. The transition to fatherhood had required a complete reorganization. of his priorities, something his assistant Marcus had adapted to with remarkable grace. Board meetings were now scheduled around school pickup times. Conference calls were interrupted by questions about homework, and Daniel's once pristine calendar was now color-coded to track everything from dentist appointments to parent-teacher conferences. Did they say what they needed to discuss? Just the usual enrollment paperwork, but also some concerns about the children's adjustment. Apparently, they've been very quiet in class. Daniel wasn't surprised. Emma and Ethan had thrown themselves into their new routine with the adaptability of children, but he could see the stress in the careful way they asked for things, as if they were afraid of being told no, or in the way they thanked him profusely for every small kindness. They were still waiting, he realized, for the other shoe to drop, for this dream to end, and for them to find themselves alone again. "I'll be there at 3, Daniel told Maria. "Can you stay with them after school?" Of course. We were planning to work on their thank you cards for Dr. Martinez anyway. The thank you cards were another one of those details that revealed how differently these children had been raised. When Daniel had taken them for their first pediatric checkup, an appointment that had revealed they were behind on several vaccinations due to Sarah's inability to afford regular health care, Emma and Ethan had insisted on writing thank you notes to every staff member they'd encountered. It was a level of politeness and gratitude that spoke of a mother who had taught them to appreciate every kindness, no matter how small. "Maria," Daniel said as she turned to leave, "have I told you lately that you're a lifesaver?" She smiled, the warm expression that had helped his children feel safe in their new home. "You're learning, Mr. Remington. That's what matters. Learning." That seemed to be the theme of Daniel's life these days. Learning that 8-year-olds needed to eat more than cereal for breakfast, which had led to his first attempts at cooking, a disaster that had resulted in the smoke alarm going off, and Emma patiently teaching him how to make scrambled eggs. Learning that children's books were far more complex than he'd imagined, and that reading bedtime stories required different voices for different characters, a skill Ethan had helped him develop with the seriousness of a drama coach. Most importantly, he was learning that love, real parental love, wasn't something that happened all at once. It built slowly in moments. The first time Emma had fallen asleep during their nightly reading session, her small hand still clutching his sleeve. The morning Ethan had shyly asked if he could help Daniel with work, leading to a 2-hour session where his son had very seriously helped him organize his desk supplies. The evening when both children had climbed into his lap during a movie, their warm weight settling against him with a trust that felt like the greatest gift he'd ever received. At 3 o'clock sharp, Daniel found himself sitting in the principal's office of Lincoln Elementary School, feeling remarkably like he was 8 years old himself. Mrs. Henderson, the principal, was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded him of his own childhood teachers. "Mr. Remington, thank you for coming in," she began, settling behind her desk with a thick folder. "I wanted to discuss Emma and Ethan's adjustment to their new school." "Is there a problem?" Daniel asked, immediately on alert. "Are they misbehaving?" "Quite. The opposite, actually. Their teachers tell me they're exceptionally well-behaved, almost too well-behaved if you understand what I mean. They don't speak unless spoken to, they never ask for help, and they seem almost afraid to make mistakes." Daniel felt a familiar pang of guilt. "They've been through a lot of changes recently." "Yes, I understand their mother is in the hospital. That must be very difficult for them." Mrs. Henderson's expression was compassionate, but also slightly puzzled. "I have to ask, Mr. Remington, we have no record of previous schooling for the children, and their emergency contacts were unusual." Daniel had been dreading this conversation. The children's school records were spotty at best. Sarah had moved frequently, apparently, working at different schools throughout the city as a substitute teacher while trying to find full-time employment. The picture that emerged was of a woman doing everything she could to provide stability for her children while struggling with her own financial insecurity. Their mother was a substitute teacher, Daniel explained carefully. She moved around quite a bit for work, and I think some of the school transfers weren't properly documented. Mrs. Henderson nodded, but Daniel could see the questions in her eyes. And you're their father? I'm sorry, but we'll need to see some documentation. Birth certificates, custody agreements, that sort of thing. Of course. Daniel had anticipated this and had his lawyer working on getting copies of all necessary documents. The birth certificates had been the hardest part. Seeing his own name listed as father on official documents for children he'd never known existed had been a shock that still left him reeling. I'll have everything to you by tomorrow. Mr. Remington, may I speak frankly? Daniel nodded, steeling himself for another lecture about the responsibilities of parenthood. Emma and Ethan are remarkable children. They're polite, intelligent, and clearly well-loved, but they're also exhibiting signs of children who have experienced instability. They hoard food from lunch, they ask permission for everything, and they seem terrified of being a burden. With time and consistency, these behaviors will likely improve, but I wanted you to be aware. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. His children were hoarding food. His children, who now lived in a penthouse apartment with a fully stocked kitchen, were saving crackers from their school lunch because some part of them still feared going hungry. What can I do? He asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. What you're already doing, providing stability, patience, and love. Children are remarkably resilient, Mr. Remington. Emma and Ethan will learn to trust that their new situation is permanent, but it will take time. As Daniel drove home through the busy Chicago streets, Mrs. Henderson's words echoed in his mind. How long would it take for his children to believe that they were safe? How many meals would they need to share before Emma stopped slipping crackers into her pockets? How many nights would Ethan need to fall asleep secure in his own bed before he stopped checking to make sure his sister was safe? The penthouse felt different now with children in it. The stark, modern lines that had once felt sophisticated now seemed cold and unwelcoming. Daniel had already ordered warmer furniture for the living areas, softer lighting for the bedrooms, and enough children's books to stock a small library. But he was beginning to understand that making a house feel like a home required more than just buying the right furniture. "Daddy!" Emma's voice greeted him as he stepped off the elevator. She came running toward him with the enthusiasm that still surprised him every time. This complete, unself-conscious joy at his return. Behind her, Ethan followed at a more measured pace, but his face lit up with the same pleasure. How was school? Today, Daniel asked, crouching down to accept Emma's enthusiastic hug. We learned about fractions, she announced proudly, and Mrs. Johnson said my reading is really good. That's wonderful, sweetheart. What about you, buddy? He asked Ethan. I finished my math worksheet early, so Mr. Garcia let me help him organize the supplies. Ethan's voice carried the pride of someone who'd been given an important responsibility. It was such a normal conversation, the kind millions of parents had with their children every day. But for Daniel, it represented something miraculous. The gradual construction of a family routine. The slow building of trust and connection that he'd never thought he wanted, but now couldn't imagine living without. Maria's making spaghetti for dinner, Emma continued, tugging on his hand. She said we could help. Do you want to help too? The idea of Daniel Remington, billionaire tech mogul, standing in a kitchen learning to make homemade pasta from his nanny would have been laughable 6 months ago. Now it sounded like the perfect way to spend an evening. I'd love to help, he said, meaning it completely. That evening, as they sat around the dining table, the new one he'd bought specifically because it was smaller and warmer than his previous glass monstrosity, Daniel watched Emma and Ethan attack their spaghetti with the focused intensity of children who genuinely enjoyed their food. Maria had worked wonders in the kitchen, but more than that, she'd helped create an atmosphere where his children felt comfortable enough to be children, to get sauce on their faces and laugh at their own mistakes. "Daddy," Emma said suddenly, looking up from her plate with a serious expression, "when is Mama coming home?" The question he'd been dreading. Daniel had spoken with Sarah's doctors that morning. She was doing well enough to be discharged within the week, but where she would go remained an open question. His penthouse had plenty of room, and the practical side of him argued that it made sense for her to stay there during her recovery, but the emotional complications of that arrangement were staggering. "Soon, sweetheart," he said carefully. "The doctors want to make sure she's completely better first." "Will she live with us?" Ethan asked, his voice carefully neutral in the way that meant he was prepared for disappointment. Daniel felt the weight of 3 pairs of eyes on him. Retry M, continue, edit. Daniel felt the weight of 3 pairs of eyes on him. Emma's hopeful, Ethan's guarded, and Maria's carefully neutral, but clearly concerned. The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything he thought he understood about his new reality. That's something your mama and I will need to talk about," Daniel said finally, hating how inadequate the words sounded even. As he spoke them, Emma's face fell slightly, though she tried to hide her disappointment. "But we could all be together, right? Like a real family." The innocence of the question nearly undid him. In Emma's 8-year-old mind, families lived together, loved each other, and solved their problems through proximity and good intentions. She had no way of understanding the complex web of hurt, guilt, and unresolved feelings that existed between her parents. The 12 years of silence that couldn't be erased by a chance meeting in a hospital corridor. "Emma, honey," Daniel said gently, "families come in all different shapes. What matters most is that you and Ethan are loved and safe. Your mama and I both love you very much, and we're going to figure out what's best for everyone." It was a classic adult non-answer, and Ethan's expression suggested he recognized it as such. At 8 years old, his son had already learned to read between the lines of grown-up conversations, to brace himself for the disappointments that adults tried to soften with careful language. After dinner, as Maria helped the children with their homework, and Daniel retreated to his study to catch up on the work calls he'd missed, his phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and Daniel felt his heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the girl he'd fallen in love with 14 years ago. "Hello, Sarah." "Hi." Her voice was still weak from her illness, but there was something else there too, a careful distance that hadn't been present in their brief conversations about the children's welfare. "The nurses said you called earlier about coming home. The doctors think you'll be ready for discharge in a few days. We should probably talk about arrangements." A long pause. In the background, Daniel could hear the familiar sounds of a hospital, distant conversations, the beep of monitors, the soft squeak of wheels on linoleum. "Daniel, I need you to understand something," Sarah said finally, her voice stronger now. "I'm grateful for what you've done for Emma and Ethan. More grateful than I can express, but I won't be a charity case." The words stung, partly because there was truth in them. "That's not, isn't it?" Sarah interrupted, and for a moment he heard an echo of the fierce independence that had first attracted him to her. "You're worth what? $1 billion now? 2 billion? I looked you up. Daniel, I know who you've become, and I'm still the same person I was 12 years ago. A teacher who works 2 jobs and shops at thrift stores. Sarah, please. My children are wearing clothes that cost more than I make in a month. They're living in a penthouse apartment and eating meals prepared by a nanny who probably earns more than I do. How exactly is this supposed to work when I come home? Do I move into your guest room and pretend we're playing house?" Daniel closed his eyes, pressing his fingers to his temples where a headache was beginning to form. I don't know, he admitted. I don't have all the answers, Sarah. 3 weeks ago, I didn't even know I was a father. I'm making this up as I go along. Another pause, longer this time. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was softer, more vulnerable. They call you Daddy. Yes. Emma told me you read to them every night. Ethan said you helped him with his math homework. They're incredible kids, Sarah. You did an amazing job raising them. I did it alone. The words were quiet but carried the weight of 8 years of struggle. Do you have any idea what that was like? Working 3 jobs to pay for daycare, staying up all night when they were sick because I couldn't afford to miss work, explaining why other kids had daddies and they didn't? Daniel felt each word like a physical blow. I didn't know because you didn't want to know. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. You made your choice, Daniel. You chose your dreams over us. And I accepted that. I built a life, raised our children, found a way to be happy without you. And now I don't know what to think. My children love you. They light up when they talk about you. And I can see how much they've missed having a father figure. But I also see how confused they are. How they're walking on eggshells trying to figure out where they fit in your world. Daniel thought about Emma's careful thank you notes, about Ethan's surprise when Daniel had ruffled his hair that morning, about the way both children still asked permission before touching anything in the apartment. They're adjusting, he said, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince Sarah or himself. Are they, or are they performing? These are children who learned very young that being good, being quiet, being grateful meant adults wouldn't leave. Do you understand the kind of damage that can do? The conversation was spiraling into territory Daniel wasn't prepared to navigate. Every instinct he'd developed in business, the ability to control negotiations, to find win-win solutions, to manage complex relationships, felt useless in the face of Sarah's raw honesty. What do you want me to do? He asked finally. Walk away, pretend I never met them. I want you to think about what's best for them, not what's convenient for you. Sarah's voice was steady now, controlled. I want you to understand that being a parent isn't something you can fit into your schedule between board meetings. It's not a project you can complete or a problem you can solve by throwing money at it. I know that. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've tried to buy your way into their lives. New clothes, new school, new home. Everything except the one thing they really need, which is consistency, security, the knowledge that you're not going to disappear again. The minute being a father becomes inconvenient. The accusation hung between them, and Daniel found he had no defense against it. How could he prove his commitment when his track record suggested the opposite? How could he convince Sarah, and more importantly, convince Emma and Ethan that this time was different? I'm not going anywhere, he said finally. You said that before. The simple statement contained 12 years of hurt, and Daniel felt the full weight of his past choices settling on his shoulders. He'd been so focused on the practical aspects of suddenly becoming a father, the logistics of childcare and school enrollment and creating a safe home, that he'd avoided confronting the deeper emotional reality of what his absence had cost. Sarah, I need to go, she interrupted. The nurses want to do another round of tests. But Daniel, we need to figure this out before I come home. Not just the living arrangements, but all of it, because I won't let my children get attached to something that might disappear. The line went dead, leaving Daniel alone in his study, with the weight of Sarah's words and the sound of his children's laughter drifting in from the living room. Through the partially open door, he could see Emma and Ethan working on a puzzle with Maria, their heads bent together in concentration. They looked happy, settled, secure in the routine they'd built over the past 3 weeks. But were they? Or were they, as Sarah suggested, simply performing the role of grateful children, afraid to ask for too much in case it all disappeared? That night, as Daniel tucked Emma into bed, a ritual that still felt new and precious. She looked up at him with those serious green eyes that reminded him so much of her mother. "Daddy, are you and Mama fighting?" The question caught him off guard. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart? You looked sad after you talked to her on the phone, and Ethan said maybe we won't all live together after all." Daniel sat on the edge of her bed, choosing his words carefully. "Your mama and I have some grown-up things we need to figure out, but that doesn't change how much we both love you and Ethan." Emma considered this with the seriousness of a child who'd learned to read adult emoticons for signs of danger. "If you and Mama can't figure it out, will we have to choose?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. Choose. In Emma's experience, love was apparently a zero-sum game, something that could be withdrawn as easily as it was given, something that required careful management and constant gratitude. "Oh, sweetheart, no," Daniel said, pulling her into his arms. "You will never, ever have to choose. Your mama and I might need to work out some complicated grown-up stuff, but you and Ethan are stuck with both of us forever, okay? No matter what." Emma relaxed slightly in his arms, but Daniel could feel the residual tension in her small body. How many times had she and Ethan had this conversation in whispered voices? How many nights had they lain awake worrying about what would happen to them if the adults in their lives couldn't figure things out? "I love you, Emma," Daniel said, the words coming easier now after 3 weeks of practice. "Nothing is gonna change that." "I love you too, Daddy," she whispered back, and the trust in her voice was both a gift and a responsibility that took his breath away. After Emma fell asleep, Daniel found Ethan in his room, sitting by the window and staring out at the Chicago skyline. His son had inherited Daniel's tendency toward introspection, but at 8 years old, that quality manifested as a sometimes heartbreaking seriousness. "Can't sleep, buddy?" Ethan shrugged, not turning from the window. "Just thinking." Daniel sat down beside him on the window seat, following his gaze out to the city lights. "Want to talk about what you're thinking about?" "Before you came, it was just me and Mama and Emma," Ethan said quietly. "I was the man of the house. Mama always said so." The words carried a weight that no 8-year-old should have to bear. And Daniel felt another piece of his heart break for all the ways his absence had shaped his children's lives. "You did a good job taking care of them," Daniel said. "But you know what? You don't have to be the man of the house anymore. You just get to be a kid." Ethan finally turned to look at him, his expression skeptical. "But what if you leave again?" There it was. The fear that lurked beneath the surface of every interaction, every bedtime story, every shared meal. His children were waiting for him to leave, because in their experience, that's what fathers did. "I'm not leaving, Ethan, I promise." "Adults make promises they can't keep sometimes," Ethan said with devastating wisdom. "Mama told us that's not their fault, but it still hurts." Daniel thought about all the promises he'd made and broken in. His life, to Sarah, to business partners, to himself. But this felt different. This felt like the kind of promise that once made would fundamentally change who he was. "You're right," Daniel said finally. "Adults do sometimes make promises they can't keep. But this isn't one of those times. Do you know how I know?" Ethan shook his head. "Because you and Emma are the most important thing in my life now. More important than my company, more important than money, more important than anything else. And when something is that important to you, you don't walk away from it." Ethan studied his face with those unnervingly adult eyes. "What about Mama? Is she important too?" The question went to the heart of everything Daniel was struggling with. Was Sarah important? Of course she was. She was the mother of his children, the woman who'd shaped them into the remarkable people they were becoming. But she was also the woman he'd hurt, the reminder of his greatest failure, the embodiment of roads not taken and choices that couldn't be undone. "Your mama is very important," Daniel said carefully. "We may not We may not be able to be together the way you'd like, but she'll always be part of our family." Ethan nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied with this answer in a way that suggested he'd already come to similar conclusions on his own. "Okay, but Daddy..." "Yeah?" "Even if you and Mama can't figure out the grown-up stuff, can we still be a family? Just different from other families?" Daniel pulled his son into his arms, overwhelmed by the resilience and wisdom of this child who'd had to grow up too fast, but somehow hadn't lost his capacity for hope. "Yes," Daniel promised. "We'll always be a family. Maybe not the kind you see in movies, but our own kind, the kind that works for us." The next morning brought unexpected news. Daniel was reviewing quarterly reports in his study when Maria knocked on the door, her expression troubled. "Mr. Remington, the hospital called. Miss Remington checked herself out against medical advice. She's on her way here." Daniel felt his heart skip. "She's coming here? Now?" Apparently so. The children don't know yet. They're still getting ready for school. Before Daniel could respond, the elevator chimed, and he heard voices in the hallway. Sarah's voice, unmistakable despite its weakness, and the excited shrieks of Emma and Ethan discovering their mother's unexpected arrival. Daniel found them. In the living room, Sarah seated on the couch with both children pressed against her sides, her arms wrapped around them as if she could physically hold them safe forever. She looked fragile still, too thin and pale, but her eyes were bright with the fierce determination he remembered from their college days. "Sarah," Daniel said, his voice carefully neutral. "The hospital said you weren't supposed to be discharged until I discharged myself," Sarah said, her chin lifting in a gesture of defiance that was achingly familiar. "I'm tired of other people making decisions about my life." Emma looked up at her mother with worried eyes. "Are you all better, Mama?" "I'm much better, baby girl, and I missed you too much to stay in that hospital another day." Daniel could see the exhaustion in Sarah's face, the way she was forcing herself to appear stronger than she felt for the children's sake. But he could also see her resolve. She'd come here not as a patient or a charity case, but as a mother reclaiming her place in her children's lives. "Why don't you two go get ready for school?" Daniel suggested gently. "Your mom and I need to talk." For a moment, it looked like the children might protest, but something in their parents' expressions must have convinced them. They kissed Sarah goodbye with promises to tell her everything about their day when they got home, then reluctantly headed off to gather their backpacks. Once they were alone, Sarah and Daniel faced each other across the expanse of his living room. Two people who'd once planned a future together, now struggling to navigate the complex present they'd created. "You can't just check yourself out of the hospital, Sarah. You're still recovering." "I'm fine," Sarah said, though the slight tremor in her voice suggested otherwise. "And I can take care of myself. I've been doing it for a long time." "That's not..." Daniel stopped himself, recognizing the futility of that argument. "Okay, what do you want to do? Where do you want to go?" Sarah's expression softened slightly at his change in tone. "I want to go home. My real home. Emma and Ethan know where their things are." Daniel thought about the cramped two-bedroom apartment he'd seen in the social services report. Outdated appliances, thin walls, a neighborhood that was safe enough but far from ideal. The contrast with his penthouse was stark, and the practical side of him rebelled against the idea of his children returning to such circumstances. "Sarah, be reasonable. That apartment isn't suitable for what? For your children." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. "That apartment was good enough when I was raising them alone. It was good enough when I was working 3 jobs to keep a roof over their heads. But now that you've decided to play father, suddenly it's not suitable. That's not what I meant, isn't it?" Sarah struggled to her feet, swaying slightly before catching herself on the arm of the couch. "Let me be very clear about something, Daniel. I don't need to be rescued. I don't need you to swoop in with your money and your guilt and fix my life. What I need is for you to figure out how to be their father without erasing their history. The conversation was heading toward familiar territory, the same independence versus support dynamic that had torn them apart 12 years ago. But this time, there were children involved, two innocent lives that would be shaped by whatever decision they made. Then help me figure it out, Daniel said, his voice quieter now. Tell me what you need. Tell me what they need. Because I don't know how to do this, Sarah. I don't know how to be a father. I don't know how to navigate co-parenting with someone He trailed off, unsure how to finish that sentence. Someone you what? Daniel looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since that night in the hospital. She was older now, marked by years of struggle he'd been absent for. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and worried days, a wariness in her expression that hadn't been there when they were young. But underneath all of that, he could still see traces of the girl he'd fallen in love with, the fierce spirit, the unwavering loyalty, the capacity for love that had shaped their children into the remarkable people they were becoming. Someone I hurt, he said finally. Someone I failed. Someone who deserved better than I gave her. Sarah's anger seemed to deflate slightly, replaced by something that might have been sadness. We were kids, Daniel. We wanted different things. Did we, or did I just convince myself we did because it was easier than admitting I was scared? The question hung between them, touching on wounds that had never properly healed. But before Sarah could respond, they heard voices in the hallway. Emma and Ethan returning from their quick trip to gather their school things, their animated chatter filling the space that had been heavy with unresolved tension just moments before. We should talk about this later, Sarah said quietly, when they're not around. Daniel nodded, but part of him wondered if there would ever be a right time for such conversations. Some things were too big, too complicated, too laden with history, to be resolved in a single discussion. As the children burst back into the living room, backpacks in hand and faces bright with excitement about having their mother home, Daniel made a decision that surprised even him. What if, he said carefully, we took this one day at a time? No big decisions, no long-term plans, just figuring it out as we go. Sarah looked at him with surprise, perhaps hearing an echo of the boy she'd once known, the one who'd been willing to take risks, to leap without looking, to trust that things would work out somehow. One day at a time, she repeated slowly. Mama, are you coming to school with us? Emma asked hopefully. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile Daniel had seen from her since their reunion. Not today, sweetheart, but maybe I could pick you up this afternoon, if that's okay with your daddy. The casual use of your daddy in reference to Daniel sent a strange thrill through him, an acknowledgement perhaps of his place in their children's lives, even if his place in Sarah's remained undefined. That sounds perfect, Daniel said, as he watched his children kiss their mother goodbye and head off to school with Maria. Daniel found himself thinking about second chances, how rare they were, how easily they could be squandered, how much courage it took to reach for them when they appeared. He didn't know if he and Sarah could find their way back to each other. Too much had happened. Too many years had passed. Too many words had been spoken that couldn't be taken back. But watching her with Emma and Ethan, seeing the love and fierce protectiveness in her eyes, Daniel realized that maybe that wasn't the question that mattered. Maybe the question was whether they could build something new, not a reconstruction of what they'd once had, but something entirely different. A family that looked like theirs, that worked for their specific circumstances, that honored their past while making room for their future. As Sarah settled back onto the couch, her energy visibly flagging now that the children were gone, Daniel found himself remembering something she'd said to him years ago during one of their late-night conversations about dreams and futures. Sometimes, she'd said, the best things in life are the ones you never planned for. Looking at this woman who'd raised his children with such grace and strength, who'd built a life from the pieces he'd left behind, Daniel thought she might have been more right than either of them had known. The best things in life, like Emma's laugh, like Ethan's quiet wisdom, like the chance to be the father he'd never imagined becoming, were indeed the ones he'd never planned for. And maybe, just maybe, there were still more unplanned blessings waiting to be discovered. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Millionaire Mindset Tales and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story. Also, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city, country, or even a flag emoji in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. And of course, if this touched your heart, leave a like to support the channel. Thank you for being here.